Imagine standing in a courtroom accused of a crime you did not commit. The weight of 100 judgmental eyes presses down on you, their silent verdict already passed before you have spoken a single word. Yet, within you lies a truth so powerful, so undeniable, that it could shatter every false assumption in the room. The courtroom was eerily silent, the only sound coming from the slow, deliberate ticking of the grand clock mounted high on the wall. The heavy air carried the unspoken biases of those present, thick with judgment. Wooden benches lined the room, occupied by onlookers whispering among themselves in hushed disbelief. Some leaned in, exchanging murmurs of suspicion, while others sat stiffly, arms crossed, their expressions cold and unwavering, as if the outcome had already been decided. At the center of it all, standing behind the defendant's table, was Malik, a 10-year-old boy. Though small in stature, his eyes carried something far more profound than fear. His trembling hands rested on the polished wood, fingers curling slightly as his heart pounded so violently he could barely hear anything beyond its rhythm. The imposing figure of Judge Whitmore loomed above, his voice void of warmth or concern. "Malik Carter," he called out, adjusting his glasses with a sigh of disinterest, as though the boy's fate was merely a formality. "You have been accused of theft. The evidence against you is compelling, and I see no reason to believe otherwise." Malik swallowed hard, his gaze sweeping over the audience. He saw their faces, people who had never truly seen him before. They did not see a boy, an individual with dreams, innocence, or a story. They saw only what they expected to see: a poor black child, a troublemaker, a thief. The sting of those unspoken accusations burned, not because they held any truth, but because they had been said about boys like him for generations. This moment was about more than just him. It was about history. It was about the weight of centuries pressing down on his small shoulders. His mother sat in the front row, her hands clutched tightly around her purse, knuckles turning pale from the force of her grip. Her lips, pressed together in a thin, desperate line, trembled ever so slightly. Though she remained silent, her eyes spoke the plea she was not allowed to voice in this place. "Please, Malik, choose your words carefully." But Malik had never been afraid of words. He understood their power. The prosecutor, a tall, thin man with slicked-back hair and a self-satisfied smirk, cleared his throat before stepping forward. Adjusting his expensive suit, he addressed the judge with unwavering confidence. "Your Honor, the store owner himself identified this boy as the culprit. The stolen items were discovered near the alleyway where he was last seen. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a boy of his description running from the scene. This is an open and shut case." Malik's fingers clenched into tight fists against the table. He wanted to scream. He wanted to shake them, to make them understand that they were wrong, that they didn't know the full truth. But he knew better. He had learned that in rooms like this, the loudest voice was never the one that was truly heard. The voice that made a difference was the one that spoke with unwavering conviction. Judge Whitmore exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple as if this case was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Before I pass judgment, does the defendant have anything to say in his own defense?" The room seemed to shrink. All eyes locked onto Malik. Some were indifferent, others amused, but most of them had already decided his fate before he had spoken a single word. He inhaled deeply, gathering every ounce of courage he had. And then, with a voice that refused to waver, he spoke. "The store owner never saw my face," Malik said, his words steady despite the storm raging inside him. "He saw a boy who looked like me, but he never saw me." A murmur rippled through the crowd, shifting the energy in the room. The judge's narrowed gaze fixated on the boy, searching for meaning behind his words. "What exactly are you suggesting, young man?" Malik straightened his shoulders, refusing to shrink beneath their scrutiny. "I'm suggesting that you're looking at me, but you're not seeing me. You're seeing what you expect to see." A hush fell over the courtroom. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, thick with judgment and assumptions that clung to Malik like a heavy chain. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his voice, steady and unshaken, cut through the silence like a blade. If I had been someone else, someone who didn't look like me, would you have already decided I was guilty? A murmur rippled through the room. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp eyes and an air of quiet confidence, scoffed. This is not a debate about race. Malik did not flinch. His voice did not waver. But it is, he countered, his words striking like thunder. Because if it weren't, you'd be asking for real evidence, not just assumptions. Judge Whitmore's frown deepened, a flicker of something unfamiliar crossing her face. Discomfort, perhaps. She was not used to being questioned, especially not by a child. Malik turned his gaze to the prosecutor, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. You said people saw a boy running from the store, but did they see my face? Did they see what I was wearing? Or did they just see a black boy and assume it was me? The silence that followed was deafening. His pulse roared in his ears, but he did not stop. He could not stop. I didn't take anything. I wasn't even near that store that day. But none of that mattered, did it? Because no one even considered that I might be telling the truth. His words hung heavy in the air, like storm clouds gathering before the first crack of lightning. For the first time, some of the spectators shifted uneasily, their certainty beginning to fray at the edges. The judge tapped her fingers against the desk, a slow, deliberate rhythm.
Then she did something she hadn't done before. She looked at him, really looked at him, not as a name on a file, not as another case, not as another statistic, but as a boy, a human being. "Do you have any proof to support your claim?" she asked. Malik's throat went dry. His mind raced, his chest tightened. Then from the front row, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor cut through the quiet like a razor. His mother rose to her feet. "I do," she said, her voice steady and strong. And just like that, the air in the courtroom shifted. Malik had always known that the world was not fair. He had seen it in the way strangers watched him when he walked into a store, in the way teachers monitored him more closely than his classmates, in the way police cars slowed whenever he and his friends walked down the sidewalk. At just 10 years old, he had learned lessons that some people would never have to. Keep your head down. Don't talk back. Stay out of trouble. But no matter how well he followed the rules, trouble had a way of finding him. His mother had worked tirelessly to protect him from a world that had already made up its mind about him. She worked 2 jobs, came home exhausted, and yet every night she found the strength to remind him, "You are not just another kid in the system. You are more than what they see." But no matter how many times she said it, Malik could never quite shake the feeling that the world had already written his story before he had the chance to. And now, standing in this courtroom, that feeling had never been stronger. At the front of the room, behind the towering wooden bench, Judge Whitmore studied him. She had spent decades in this courthouse, taking pride in her ability to clean up the streets and teach troubled kids a lesson. She had sentenced dozens of boys just like Malik, and to her, this case was no different. A black boy, a poor neighborhood, a theft. It was a story she had heard too many times before. She believed she was fair. She believed in consequences, in discipline, in making sure those who stood before her understood the weight of their actions. But what she did not realize, what no one had ever made her see, was that her version of justice was built not on truth, but on bias, on the quiet, unspoken belief that some people were simply more likely to be guilty than others. And Malik fit the description. The prosecutor had laid it out so neatly. A boy matching his description had been seen running from the scene. A store had been robbed. The stolen items were found nearby. What more was there to discuss? She had already made up her mind before he even spoke. But Malik knew the truth. On the day of the robbery, he had not been anywhere near that store. He had been with his little sister, walking her home from school. She had fallen and scraped her knee, and he had stopped to help her, using his own shirt to wipe away the blood. That was his only crime, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. When the police stopped him, they had not asked him where he had been. They had not listened when he tried to explain. They had taken one look at him, his skin, his clothes, and decided, guilty. And now he was here, standing in front of a judge who had already written his fate. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, with whispers of people who thought they knew how this would end. Some shook their heads, convinced that kids like him were always up to no good. Others barely paid attention at all, because trials like this happened all the time, and they always ended the same way. But Malik refused to let them write his story for him. He lifted his chin, he squared his shoulders, he stood taller, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of their judgment. His gaze locked onto the judges. His voice did not tremble. "I didn't do this." Judge Whitmore exhaled, her expression unreadable. "Then prove it." Malik knew the truth alone might not be enough. He knew that, in rooms like this, truth did not always matter. But he had one thing no one could take from him: his voice. And today he was going to use it. The air inside the courtroom was suffocating, thick with unspoken judgment. It wasn't in the words people spoke. It lived in their narrowed eyes, in the subtle shake of a head from a stranger, in the way the officer by the door straightened slightly when Malik passed by. He felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him, but he refused to let his fear show. He had made a promise to himself. He would not break. From her high seat on the bench, Judge Whitmore exhaled sharply, her gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Malik. She was already weary, her exhaustion laced with certainty. She had seen cases like this before. She had sentenced boys like him before. And in her mind, she already knew exactly how this was going to end. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The state versus Malik Carter." The whispers started instantly. "Just another kid who got caught up in trouble. His kind always end up here. They'll let him off easy, and he'll be back next week." Malik's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his expression remained unreadable. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. The prosecutor, a man as sharp as the lines of his expensive suit, stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "Your Honor, we have eyewitnesses, we have physical evidence, and we have a pattern. This young man comes from a background that has led too many down the same road. This is not just about one crime, it's about the kind of future we are trying to prevent." Judge Whitmore nodded slowly, as if she had already made up her mind. Then her gaze shifted back to Malik. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" He stepped forward, clearing his throat. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head. He had played out the words over and over, forming the perfect defense. But now, standing before them, those words felt too small. The truth was never something that fit neatly into a single sentence. Still, he had to try. He took a breath. "The last time I saw my sister," he said, his voice steady but quiet, "she told me she'd come back." A pause. "But she never did." The whisper stopped. The air in the courtroom shifted, charged with something heavier. Even Judge Whitmore seemed caught off guard. Malik swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. "She went out one night, just to the store, just for a few minutes. But she never made it back." His voice tightened, but he refused to let it break. "And you know what they told my mother when she asked for help? They told her my sister must have run away. That girls like her always do. That she wasn't worth looking for." His gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had already decided his guilt before he had spoken a single word. "And now, I'm standing here, accused of something I didn't do. And you're telling me the same thing, that boys like me always end up here. That it doesn't matter what I say, because you've already made up your mind." Judge Whitmore shifted in her seat, but Malik didn't stop. "You say you have witnesses," he continued, his voice rising with quiet strength. "But did they see my face? Did they see what I was wearing? Or did they just see a black boy running and assume it was me?" Silence. Not a single answer. He turned to the prosecutor. "You say there's a pattern, but whose pattern is it? The one you already believe in? The one you expect? Or the one that actually exists?" The silence deepened. His heart was pounding, but his fear no longer mattered. "Because here's the truth," he said, his voice now calm, unwavering. "If I were guilty, you wouldn't need assumptions. You wouldn't need stereotypes. You wouldn't need history to tell you what kind of boy I am. You'd have proof." Judge Whitmore inhaled sharply, her expression unreadable. In all her years sitting in this courtroom, passing judgment on faces that blurred together, no one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever made her pause. Malik met her gaze, unflinching. I didn't take anything. I wasn't even there. But none of that matters, does it? Because before I walked through that door, you had already decided what kind of person I was. His words settled over the courtroom like an inescapable weight. The murmurs, the quiet scorn, the certainty that had once filled the room. Gone. Judge Whitmore looked down at the stack of papers before her. The evidence, so carefully laid out, suddenly felt less solid beneath her fingertips. The prosecutor, once so assured, shifted uncomfortably, his confidence dimming. Malik took a slow step back, his breath steady. He had said what he needed to say. Now it was up to them to decide if they would truly listen. What would you do in this boy's shoes? How do we fight for justice when the system itself is broken? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Judge Whitmore sat rigid, gavel poised in her hand. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was clipped and controlled. "This is an emotional appeal, not a defense," she said. "Without concrete evidence, words alone cannot clear you. The court has no choice but to—" Before Judge Whitmore could finish her ruling, a voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "Wait!" The single word sliced through the tense air, drawing every pair of eyes toward its source. Malik turned just in time to see his mother stepping forward, her hands trembling as she clutched a folded piece of paper. Though her fingers shook, her eyes burned with fierce determination. She held the letter up as though it were a lifeline, her voice steadier than her hands. This is my daughter's letter." For a brief moment, the courtroom remained still, suspended in the weight of her words. Judge Whitmore's expression hardened. "And how is this relevant to the case?" Malik's mother swallowed, straightening her spine as she held the paper even tighter, as though the sheer force of her grip could make them see the truth. "Because it proves my son was nowhere near that store that day," she declared. "It says right here, she was supposed to meet him that afternoon. They were together when this so-called crime took place." A ripple of shock coursed through the room, the disbelief palpable. The prosecutor, who had stood so confidently mere moments ago, frowned as he stepped forward. "Let me see that." For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Then, with quiet resolve, she extended the letter, allowing both the prosecutor and the judge to take it. The room seemed to hold its breath as Judge Whitmore unfolded the fragile piece of paper, her gaze scanning the words carefully. The silence deepened as her skeptical expression shifted, the rigid certainty in her face giving way to something unreadable. It was all there. The time, the place, the undeniable proof that Malik could not have committed the crime. Her fingers clenched around the letter, her jaw tightening. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to make swift, unwavering judgments. To see a case, weigh the evidence, and deliver a verdict without hesitation. And yet, as she stood at the precipice of another ruling, she felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. She looked up, her eyes meeting Malik's. He stood firm, unyielding, despite the weight pressing down on him. She had been prepared to dismiss him, prepared to silence him before he had the chance to prove his innocence. And now the truth stared back at her, undeniable and unshakable. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more measured. "Malik Carter." A pause, as if the name itself now carried a different weight. "This evidence changes things." The prosecutor stiffened, as though searching for a rebuttal, but he found none. The certainty he had worn so effortlessly now wavered, and for the first time, he could not bring himself to meet Malik's gaze. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs of quiet condemnation, was now wrapped in utter silence. Judge Whitmore exhaled slowly, setting the letter down with deliberate care. Her eyes moved from Malik's mother to the young man standing before her, the boy she had nearly condemned without question. Then, in a voice that carried the weight of something rare and unexpected, she said, "I was wrong to assume." A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. A judge, this judge, admitting fault was unheard of. Malik remained still, his face unreadable. He had not known what to expect, but it certainly hadn't been this. Judge Whitmore lifted her gavel. "The court finds Malik Carter not guilty." For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Then the dam broke. A rush of emotion surged through the room, overwhelming in its intensity. Malik's mother let out a shaky breath, the breath she had been holding for far too long. Tears welled in her eyes, glistening like proof of a battle finally won. The spectators shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their gazes, others stealing hesitant glances at the boy they had been so quick to judge. But the real shift, the true transformation, was not in the verdict. It was in the way Judge Whitmore looked at Malik now. Not as a case, not as a statistic, not as another name in a long line of convictions, but as a boy who had been forced to prove his own humanity in a room that should have seen it all along. Malik met her gaze, steady and unwavering. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply nodded. Because this was never just about winning a case. It was about forcing them to see. The truth had always been there. They had simply refused to look. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him. The afternoon sun met him like an old friend, its warmth draping over him, solid and unyielding, as if the very universe had bore witness to what had taken place inside. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. He had walked into that courtroom a boy accused of something he had not done. But he walked out something else entirely, a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of truth. Beside him, his mother's grip on his hand was tight, almost desperate, as if letting go might mean losing him again. He looked up at her, and for the first time in weeks he saw something in her gaze that had been missing for far too long. Relief. She said nothing. She didn't need to. He already knew. The crowd outside the courthouse had swelled, a sea of faces waiting, watching. Reporters stood poised, their cameras aimed and ready to capture the moment. Neighbors gathered, some who had doubted him from the very beginning, others who had held on to their belief in his innocence. The energy in the air was different now. The whispers that had once been filled with suspicion and quiet condemnation had shifted. He really proved them wrong. I can't believe they almost sent him away without real proof. Did you hear the way he spoke, like a man who had lived through a lifetime in just 10 years? Malik heard them, but he didn't stop. He didn't slow down to absorb their words, to revel in the fact that he had made them see. He had never fought for their attention. He had fought for something far greater, the right to be heard, to be seen, to be treated as though he mattered. Behind him, Judge Whitmore lingered at the courthouse steps, watching him walk away. Her expression had softened, the rigid certainty that had once defined her now shaken by something she couldn't yet name. Hours ago, she had been prepared to condemn him, to dismiss his words as nothing more than desperate pleas. To her, he had been just another case in a long list of names, another defendant standing before her, awaiting judgment. But now, as she stood in the fading afternoon light, she knew something inside her had changed. That evening, in an unprecedented move, she issued a public statement. I made an assumption, she admitted, her voice carrying through the news broadcasts and into the homes of those who had followed the trial. And I was wrong. Injustice doesn't always come in the form of a crime. Sometimes it's in the way we decide who is guilty before we even listen. Today, I was reminded of the importance of truth. I vow that every voice in my courtroom will be heard. It was the first time she had ever questioned herself so openly. The first time she had acknowledged, not just in silence but aloud, that the system she upheld was flawed. And though words alone would never be enough to mend what had been broken, they were a start. But Malik's story did not end within the walls of that courtroom. News of his trial rippled across the city, igniting discussions in places he had never imagined. In schools, teachers dissected his case, urging students to examine the consequences of unchecked bias. In law offices, attorneys debated the weight of assumptions in the judicial system. Across communities that had long been overlooked, conversations about fairness and justice took root, spreading like wildfire. People who had never thought twice about boys like Malik, boys who were judged before they even had a chance to speak, were beginning to see them in a different light. They saw their potential, their strength, their resilience. They saw that even a 10-year-old boy, armed with nothing but the truth, could stand against the crushing weight of injustice and refuse to be silenced. But Malik wasn't thinking about any of that as he walked through his neighborhood that evening. He wasn't thinking about the reporters still lingering outside the courthouse, the judge's admission of fault, or the murmurs that trailed behind him. He was thinking about his sister. The last time he had seen her, she had promised she would come back. She never did. And yet somehow, in some way, he felt closer to her now than he had in years. Maybe, just maybe, she had been watching over him all along. As he reached the worn steps of his front porch, he paused, tilting his head to the sky. The deepening hues of twilight stretched above him, soft purples, fiery oranges, streaks of crimson that faded into darkness. A quiet moment. A breath between what had been and what was still to come. Then, without a word, he stepped inside. His story was far from over. The courtroom had long since emptied. The gavel's final strike a memory now, but Malik's words still lingered in the minds of those who had heard them. What had begun as a routine case, one more conviction meant to be handed down without question, had turned into something far greater. An awakening, a moment where the truth had shattered prejudice, forcing those who had ignored injustice for years to finally confront it. Malik's fight had never been just about proving his own innocence. It had been about breaking a cycle, one that had existed long before him, one that threatened to swallow so many others like him. A cycle where boys who looked like him were guilty until proven innocent, where their futures were decided by people who never bothered to see them for who they truly were. Judge Whitmore's decision to overturn the charges was a victory, but it was not the kind that erased the past or ensured a different future. It was a single moment in a system that had failed too many for too long. Malik understood this. He knew his exoneration would not undo the fates of those who had been wrongfully convicted before him. He knew that tomorrow, another boy, just like him, would stand before a different judge, facing the same bias, the same quiet condemnation before he even had the chance to speak. And that was the real battle. His story did not fade away when the cameras stopped rolling. It spread. It reached places he had never set foot in, his name spoken in courtrooms, classrooms, town halls. Activists cited his case in their fight against racial injustice. Teachers used his testimony as a lesson in truth and resilience. Conversations that had once been avoided were now impossible to ignore. But Malik, sitting on the steps of his home, wasn't thinking about any of that. He watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the world in soft, fading light. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't basking in victory. He was reflecting, thinking about the people who had doubted him, the ones who had looked at him and seen only a statistic. Thinking about his sister, whose absence still left an ache in his chest that no verdict could ease. Thinking about the countless others who would come after him, the ones who would not have a voice unless someone spoke up first. He had done something important today, but he also knew one case, one verdict, one judge admitting fault would never be enough to fix what had been broken. And so the question remained, hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. Was his bravery enough to change the system? Or was it only the beginning? What do you think? How can we, as individuals, stand against injustice in a world that so often looks the other way? Your voice matters. Join the conversation below. And if you believe in the power of truth, in the strength of standing up, even when the odds are stacked against you, like, share, and subscribe. Because stories like Malik's deserve to be heard,